Frost had crept beneath the floorboards of the Sutherland house 3 years before Harlan ever raised his fist. It came in quieter than that, a cold word here, a locked door there, the gradual disappearance of everything warm until Josephine forgot warmth had ever existed. She was 23 years old, and she had already stopped counting the days. The town of Copper Ridge, pressed flat against the eastern shoulder of the Selkirk Mountains in British Columbia, was the kind of place that mistook endurance for virtue. It had been carved out of the wilderness in the early years of the 1890s by men who followed the copper seams up from the valley floor, and it wore its hardness like a badge. The winters were long and mean. The summers were brief and grudging. The people who stayed were the ones who had learned not to want too much, and they applied that same philosophy to everything, including the muffled sounds that sometimes carried across the frozen lane from the Sutherland property on Birch Creek Road. Josephine had come to Harlan Sutherland at 20, the youngest daughter of a failed mill operator from Rossland, who owed Harlan a significant sum and lacked any other currency to settle it. The arrangement had been presented to her as a marriage. There was a reverend, a dress borrowed from a cousin, and a modest reception in the church hall where people smiled at her like they were saying goodbye rather than congratulations. She understood later that they had been. Harlan owned the only general store in Copper Ridge, the postal contract, and enough unpaid accounts from the surrounding homesteaders that he effectively held the financial fate of 36 families in his ledger book. He was 51 years old, broad-faced, with a careful, civic-minded manner that he maintained with the same discipline a clockmaker applies to his mechanisms. Precise, deliberate, and utterly without warmth. He sat on the town council. He donated a pew to the Presbyterian church. He kept his boots polished even in mud season, and he never, in public, raised his voice above a moderate conversational tone. The first time he struck Josephine, she had overcooked the salt pork. It was not the kind of blow she could have anticipated. There was no change in his expression beforehand, no flicker of warning in his pale eyes. He simply set down his fork, rose from his chair, and backhanded her across the left side of her face with such measured force that she understood immediately it was not an accident. It was a statement. He sat back down, picked up his fork, and finished his meal, while she held the edge of the kitchen counter and breathed through her nose. He said nothing. That was what terrified her most. Men who shouted were men losing control. Harlan never lost control. Everything he did was a choice. Over the months that followed, Josephine learned the vocabulary of his moods the way a naturalist learns the signs of an approaching storm. The slight tightening around his jaw when a customer argued over a price, the particular way he removed his coat when he had been passed over for some civic appointment, the quality of his silence at the supper table. There was a safe silence and a dangerous one, and she learned to distinguish them the way you learn to distinguish ice that will hold your weight from ice that will not. By the time she had been married a year, she knew to read him from across a room. She also knew that no one in Copper Ridge would help her. Mrs. Edna Fogarty next door had heard the sounds. Josephine was certain of it. She had seen the older woman pause in her yard one morning, her head tilted slightly toward the Sutherland fence, listening. Their eyes had met across the frozen vegetable garden. Mrs. Edna Fogarty had bent back down to her task without a word. Her husband owed Harlan for 2 years of winter credit at the store. That was simply the arithmetic of Copper Ridge, and Josephine could not find a way to argue with it. The town's constable, a thick-necked man named Garrett who smelled perpetually of tobacco and damp wool, had responded once to a complaint from a passing traveler who had heard screaming from the property in the middle of the night. Garrett had knocked on the door with the apologetic expression of a man who already knew he was about to be embarrassed. Harlan had received him in his dressing gown with a glass of brandy and an explanation about a fox that had gotten into the hen shed. Garrett had nodded, accepted the glass Harlan pressed into his hand, and left without looking up the stairs where Josephine sat on the landing with her hands pressed over her mouth and blood drying on her collar. She stopped hoping after that. Hoping required a kind of energy she could no longer afford to spend. By the second year, the bruises had become so routine she had developed a system for them. Cold water for the first 12 hours, raw potato for the swelling around her eye, high collars and long sleeves. She became expert at presenting herself at the store counter on the days Harlan required her presence, smiling at the women who came in for flour and lamp oil, deflecting their sometimes almost questions with a bright, hollow cheerfulness that exhausted her to the bone. She told Mrs. Worsend Dunmore she had walked into a doorframe. She told young Caroline Sayers she bruised easily, always had. She told herself these were small lies and that small lies were survival. What Josephine could not tell herself was that it would stop. The third year was the worst. Harlan's copper investments, he had quietly sunk a significant portion of the store's profits into a speculative mining concern in the Slocum Valley, collapsed entirely in the autumn of 1894. The news came in a letter he read at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in October. He set the letter down beside his coffee cup with the same measured precision with which he did everything, and then he looked across the table at Josephine with his pale eyes, and she understood that whatever small restraint had existed before was gone. The beating he gave her that afternoon was different from the others. It was not methodical. It was something she had no name for, a kind of erasure, as though he were trying to expel something through her. She lost consciousness at some point. She was not sure when, and when she came back, the kitchen was growing dark, and she was on the floor between the table and the far wall, and her left arm would not move properly. She lay very still and listened to the sound of Harlan walking back and forth in the hallway above her, his tread steady and deliberate, and she thought with absolute clarity, "He will not stop until I am dead or I am gone." She did not know, lying on that kitchen floor with the October cold seeping up through the boards, that the mountain had already decided to send her something. His name was Declan Marsh, and the people who knew him called him by his surname and nothing else. He had been living in the high country above Copper Ridge for the better part of 4 years. Since returning from a prospecting season in the Yukon that had broken something in him he had never quite been able to name. He was a spare, hard man of 38, not large in the way that attracted immediate attention, but built in the way a fir tree is built, with a density and rootedness that became apparent only when something tried to move him. He had a prospector's hands and a trapper's silence, and a scar that ran in a white line from the corner of his right eye down through his beard where a pickaxe had slipped in the winter of 1891. His eyes were dark and very still, the eyes of a man who had learned to observe more than he spoke. Marsh came down from the high country twice a year, once in spring, once before the freeze, to trade his furs and restock his provisions. He wanted little from civilization, and civilization had thus far returned the courtesy. He had no opinion of Copper Ridge beyond its usefulness, and no opinion of Harlan Sutherland at all. He had traded at the store a handful of times, found the man officious and cold, and thought nothing further of it. What brought Marsh through Birch Creek Road on that October evening was nothing more than the shortest route to the livery stable. The dusk was coming in hard, the temperature already dropping toward freezing, and he was tired from 2 days on the trail with a loaded pack, and he was thinking about coffee and not about anything else, when he heard it. It was not a scream. It was something worse than a scream. It was the sound a person makes when they have stopped having the energy to scream and are simply existing in pain. A low, broken sound, barely audible above the wind that was pushing down from the mountain and rattling the bare branches overhead. Marsh stopped. He stood on the frozen road and looked at the Sutherland house. Light in the front parlor window, smoke from the chimney, the tidy, respectable face that the house showed the world. He looked at the neighboring houses on either side. Lights in those windows too. People home, people not moving. He was not a man given to philosophical reflection, but he had spent 4 years in the wilderness learning an absolute and unsentimental law. When something is in the jaws of something else, and calling for help, you do not stand on the road and wonder about jurisdiction. He walked to the front door and knocked. There was a long pause. Then footsteps, heavy, unhurried, confident, and the door opened, and Harlan Sutherland stood in the light with his careful face and his polished manner and his eyes that went immediately cold when he registered the stranger on his step. "Whatever you're selling," Harlan said, "I'm not in the market." "I'm not selling anything," Marsh said. His voice was quiet and without inflection. "I want to know who's in your house." Harlan's expression shifted by a fraction, the first real movement in his face. "I beg your pardon?" "Someone in your house is hurt." Marsh said it the same way he might report the weather. "I'd like to see them." "You are standing on private property," Harlan said, and his voice had dropped into the low, warning register of a man accustomed to ending conversations. "I don't know who you are or what you think you heard, but I suggest you move along before I call Constable Garrett." Call him, Marsh said. He did not move. Something passed through Harlan's pale eyes, surprise, and behind the surprise, the beginning of a calculation. He had managed men all his life through the simple mathematics of what he controlled and what they needed. This man in the doorway did not appear to need anything Harlan had. That made him difficult to account for. What Harlan did next was a mistake born of habit. He reached out to shut the door. Marsh put his hand against it. He did not push. He simply held it, and Harlan pushed against it, and the door did not move, and then Harlan looked up and understood with sudden clarity that the man on his step was of a different order than the men he was accustomed to managing. Marsh was not impressionable. He was not frightened. He owed Harlan nothing, and the particular freedom this gave him was entirely outside of Harlan Sutherland's experience. "Step back," Marsh said. Harlan did not step back. He was not a man who surrendered ground voluntarily. But as Marsh moved the door steadily open and stepped into the hallway with the calm inevitability of water finding a low place, Harlan found himself taking a step backward anyway, because the alternative was to be physically moved, and some part of his body understood before his mind did that this was the probable outcome. "Where is she?" Marsh said. It was not a question. From the kitchen came a sound, a small, involuntary sound, someone trying to be quiet and failing, and Marsh walked toward it, and Harlan's hand closed around his arm with a grip built from years of hauling freight and breaking down stock crates. And Marsh looked down at the hand on his arm with a brief, flat expression. "Don't," Marsh said. And then he looked at Harlan with those still, dark eyes, and what Harlan Sutherland saw in them, or perhaps what he failed to see, the particular absence of intimidation, the absence of anything that could be leveraged or threatened, made him release his grip. Marsh went into the kitchen. Josephine was on the floor, partially upright against the far wall, her knees drawn up and her good arm braced against the baseboard. She was pale to the color of birch bark, her dark hair tangled and loose, one eye swollen nearly shut. When the stranger came through the kitchen doorway, she flinched so hard she made a sound against her will, and her good arm came up to cover her face. "It's all right," Marsh said, crouching down to her level with the automatic, practical calm of someone who had administered aid in bad conditions before. "I'm not going to touch you unless you say so." She lowered her arm a fraction and looked at him with the one eye that would open. "Can you stand?" he asked. "My arm," she said. Her voice was barely there. "I can see it." He had seen broken limbs before, and he did not look away from hers. "We need to get you somewhere warmer than this floor. Can you tell me where your coat is?" Behind them, Harlan appeared in the doorway. He had recovered himself somewhat. His face had reassembled into its civic mask, though the mask fit less well than usual. "She fell," Harlan said. "She is clumsy. I was about to send for the doctor." Marsh did not look up from Josephine. "Were you going to do that before or after you stepped over her?" Harlan's jaw moved. "I don't know who you think you are, but I am a counselor of this town, and I will see you charged with trespass and assault, and anything else I can make stick. You have no right to be in my home." "Her coat," Marsh said, still to Josephine. "Where is it?" "The hook by the back door," she whispered. He retrieved it, a heavy wool coat, the kind that has been mended and mended again, until the mending is as much the coat as the original fabric, and he helped her into it with a care so entirely unlike anything she had experienced in 3 years that it briefly undid her. She had to look at the wall to keep herself together. "Constable Garrett will hear about this tonight," Harlan said from the doorway. His voice had recovered its evenness. "You'll be in a cell before morning." "Garrett can find me at Dr. Abernathy's," Marsh said. He straightened up, and with the most careful adjustment, took Josephine's weight onto his right side. "Can you walk?" "Yes," she said, though it was not entirely true. She walked anyway. She walked past Harlan in the doorway, close enough to smell the brandy on him, and she did not look at his face because she could not afford to, and also because she had memorized it over 3 years and did not need to look at it again. She walked out of the kitchen and down the hall and through the front door, which was still standing open with the October night coming in, and the cold hit her face and she breathed it in like a person surfacing. Dr. Abernathy was a small, precise Scotsman who had settled in Copper Ridge a decade prior and who had, in that time, seen enough of certain patterns to know better than to ask overly direct questions. He set Josephine's arm without fuss, cleaned the lacerations on her face, and pressed his lips together in a way that expressed considerable opinion without voicing any of it. When he was done, he told her she could rest in his back room. Marsh sat in the front room of the surgery on a wooden chair that was too small for him and waited. Harlan Sutherland, as promised, sent Constable Garrett. Garrett arrived at the surgery with the expression of a man who had been dragged from a comfortable chair and was unhappy about it. He looked at Marsh, then through the doorway at Josephine, who was sitting upright on the doctor's cot with her arms splinted and her face in the lamplight, and something moved through Garrett's expression that he quickly smothered. "There's a complaint," Garrett said. "Trespass. Property of Harlan Sutherland." "I know it," Marsh said. "You'll need to come with me." "I'd like to hear her make a complaint first," Marsh said. "If she does, I'll come with you. If she doesn't, you should leave." Garrett looked at Josephine. She looked back at him, steady. She thought of the night 3 years ago when Garrett had drunk Harlan's brandy and looked away. She thought of every Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday night that Garrett had been on duty and done nothing. She thought of what she had to lose, which was not very much anymore, and what she had to gain, which was the possibility of not dying in that house. "I have no complaint against this man," Josephine said. Garrett looked at the floor. Then he looked at Marsh. Then he looked at the floor again. "Mr. Sutherland is pressing the matter," Garrett said, without conviction. "Constable." Dr. Abernathy had appeared in the doorway of the back room, his accent thickening slightly in the way it did when he was controlled angry. "I have here a patient with a displaced fracture of the ulna, 3 cracked ribs, facial lacerations consistent with repeated blunt force, and contusions in varying stages of healing across her torso and upper arms. If you would like to discuss who ought to be answering questions tonight, I am available to have that conversation." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "I'll need a full statement," he said, to no one in particular. "You'll have one," Abernathy said. Garrett left. He did not go to Harlan Sutherland's house that night, whether out of conscience or simple self-preservation, was never entirely clear. What was clear was that in the morning he sent a letter to the district constabulary office in Nelson requesting that an inspector be dispatched to Copper Ridge regarding an ongoing domestic matter, which was more than he had done in 3 years of knowing and doing nothing, and which was, if not adequate, at least a beginning. Josephine could not go back to Birch Creek Road. That was simply a fact. She had nothing, no money that was hers, no property, no family within 3 days' travel who would take her in. Dr. Abernathy let her stay in the back room for 2 nights, which was as much as his household could accommodate. On the 3rd morning, she sat on the edge of the cot with her splinted arm and her carefully arranged face, and tried to work out what a person does when they have walked out of the one life they had with nothing. Marsh had come back each morning, not to speak, particularly. He sat in the front room and drank the doctor's coffee and was present in the way a load-bearing wall is present, not intrusive, simply there. On the 3rd morning he came in and set a folded piece of paper on the chair beside Josephine. "There's a woman named Ruth Beckett," he said. "She has a homestead about 8 miles up the Kettle Valley Road. Her husband died last spring and she's been managing alone. She's looking for help through the winter, room and meals in exchange." Josephine looked at the paper, which had a name and rough directions written on it in the careful hand of a man who has taught himself to write. "You arranged this," she said. She agreed to it. "I didn't arrange anything." She looked at him. He was standing near the door in the particular way he stood everywhere, slightly turned toward the exit, as though he did not wish to commit to having arrived. She thought about what it would mean to be 8 miles up a valley road, out of Copper Ridge, out of Harlan Sutherland's general store and postal contract and ledger book, and long, pale-eyed reach. "Why?" she said. It was the same question she had been turning over for 3 days, and she had not found a floor under it yet. Marsh lifted her for a moment. "Because you were on the floor," he said, as though this explained everything, and she thought perhaps it did. The inspector arrived from Nelson 6 days later. He was a methodical man named Forsyth, who had come up through the Mounties and had the particular practiced patience of someone accustomed to untangling situations that local authorities had been too compromised or too comfortable to untangle themselves. He reviewed Dr. Abernathy's documentation. He spoke with Josephine for 2 hours in the doctor's front room, and with Garrett, and with 3 other residents of Copper Ridge who, in the changed atmosphere of an official inquiry, found they had things to say that they had previously found easier not to say. Mrs. Fogarty came without being summoned. She sat very straight in the chair across from Inspector Forsyth and described, in a voice entirely without inflection, the sounds she had heard from the house next door for 3 years and what she had done about them, which was nothing. She said this last part looking directly at Forsyth and then at Josephine, who was sitting in the corner. And she did not look away. "I am sorry," Mrs. Fogarty said. "That is not enough." "But I am." Harlan Sutherland was arrested on a Wednesday morning, brought out of the general store in front of a dozen people who all found they had urgent business at their windows. He was taken to Nelson to await trial. He walked out of the store with his back straight and his face arranged in the expression of a man being subjected to a grotesque misunderstanding, and he stepped up into Forsyth's wagon with his chin up, and Copper Ridge watched him go. No one said anything while he was still in sight. After the wagon turned the corner onto the main road, someone said something, and then someone else did, and within an hour the stories had begun, the things people had seen, the things they had heard, the things they had not done. And the town had that particular uncomfortable quality of a place examining its own reflection and finding it unflattering, but perhaps not entirely without hope of change. Josephine spent the winter at Ruth Beckett's homestead in the Kettle Valley. Ruth was a rangy, laconic woman of 45 who had built a life on that land with her husband and was in the process of stubbornly rebuilding it without him. She did not ask Josephine a great many questions. She showed her how to muck out the small barn, how to manage the wood stove, how to preserve what the root cellar held against the long stretch of January and February. Josephine's arm healed, her ribs healed. The sleep she had not had in 3 years began, gradually, to come back to her, at first in short, fitful intervals, and then in longer, steadier stretches, until she could go a full night without waking to listen for footsteps in the hall. She thought sometimes about what healing actually meant. She had expected it to feel like something lifting, a weight removed, a door opened. Instead, it felt more like learning to walk differently, like the way an ankle healed from a bad break will still ache when the weather changes and the person learns to account for it. She was not the same person who had stood in a church in Rossland at 20 years old. She was not certain who she was yet, but she thought she was beginning to find out. Marsh came down from the high country in March, when the snow on the valley road had packed to a surface his pack horse could manage. He came to the Beckett homestead first, which he had not done before, and stood in the yard with his hat in his hand while Ruth watched from the barn door with the expression of a woman who has seen a thing or two. Josephine came out of the house and stood on the step. "The inspector wrote," she said. "Harlan will be tried in April." "I know it," Marsh said. "I got a letter in the fall. I'll have to go to Nelson to give evidence." "I know that too." She looked at him across the yard. He was thinner than he had been in October, and the winter had added lines to his face that had not been there before, and he was standing in her yard in March with his hat in his hand, and she understood that he had come to see that she was all right before he said anything else, because that was the kind of man he was. "I don't know what I'm going to do after the trial," she said. "I haven't decided." "All right," he said. "I have some ideas. Ruth has been talking about expanding the kitchen garden, and I can read and do accounts. I thought perhaps there might be work somewhere." "There's work," Marsh said. "There's always work." "I'm not the same person I was," she said, because she needed to say it to someone and she thought he would not flinch from it. "No," he said, "I wouldn't think so." She stepped down off the porch into the yard. The snow was still heavy on the Selkirks above them, the kind of white that hurt to look at directly in the March sunlight. The air smelled of snow melt and pine, and the particular cold that still lived in the shadows even when the sun was warm. "Thank you," she said, "for coming." "I was coming down anyway," Marsh said, which was probably partly true. Ruth appeared at the barn door. "If someone doesn't come and hold this fence post in the next 5 minutes," she called out, "I'm doing it myself and I am in a very bad mood." Marsh turned toward the barn. He put his hat back on. Josephine followed. That was how it was with them. Not sudden, not spoken of in the way that things get spoken of in stories, but built the same way the homestead had been built, and the way the valley had been settled, and the way anything that lasts is built, one post at a time in the cold, with your hands. Harlan Sutherland was convicted in the spring assizes and sentenced to 7 years hard labor at the new Westminster Penitentiary. The trial was reported in the Nelson Miner, under a headline that was factual and thorough, in which several copies have found their way to Copper Ridge, where they were read with a complicated mixture of relief and shame. Constable Garrett resigned his position in April, citing his health, and was replaced in June by a man from Kamloops who did not owe anyone anything. Mrs. Edna Fogarty planted a kitchen garden that spring that was larger than any she had planted before, and she left a basket of early kale on the Beckett homestead porch one morning in May without a note, though everyone understood well enough what it meant. Josephine gave her evidence in Nelson and came home to the Kettle Valley with the particular lightness of someone who has said the true thing in a room where it needed to be said and been believed. She stood in the yard in the May evening and looked up at the Selkirks, still white at their peaks, and breathed the air, which smelled of new grass and cold water coming down from the snowpack. She had carried nothing out of Birch Creek Road the night she left. No money, no property, not even a photograph. She had not gone back for any of it. What she had instead was a valley she knew now, in all its seasons, and the work of her own hands, and a voice that she was slowly relearning to use without apology. She had lost 3 years. She knew enough about loss by now to know she would not recover them, that recovery was not actually the shape of what happened, not a return but a continuation, beginning from wherever you happened to be standing when the darkness finally let you go. She was standing in a valley in British Columbia in the spring of the year, with the mountain above her and good work ahead of her, and she was 24 years old and she was, against everything, still here. That was where she began. I keep thinking about the moment Josephine walked past Harlan in that hallway, not running, walking. That detail stays with me more than any other part of the story. There's something in it that I've been trying to put into words for a while now, and I think it comes down to this. The way a person is treated, day after day, year after year, shapes what they believe they deserve. Harlan didn't just hurt Josephine physically. He rebuilt her understanding of the world from the ground up, rebuilt it so that locked doors felt normal and silence from neighbors felt expected, and a constable drinking your abuser's brandy felt like the logical conclusion of asking for help. That kind of damage is patient and methodical, and it works, until something interrupts it. What interrupts it, in Josephine's case, is a man who simply doesn't owe Harlan Sutherland anything. Marsh isn't a hero in the way stories usually mean that word. He doesn't arrive with a plan or a speech. He hears a sound on a road he was already walking down, and he stops, because stopping when something is wrong is just the right thing. It costs him something. He knows it will. He stops anyway. That's what decency actually looks like when you strip away everything ceremonial about it. It's not grand. It's just a person deciding that what they're witnessing matters more than their own convenience. I think about what it took for Josephine to say, in that surgery I have no complaint against this man. 3 years of being returned, dismissed, disbelieved. 3 years of learning that speaking up made things worse. And she said it anyway. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. That kind of clarity, when it comes from someone who has had every reason to go quiet, is one of the strongest things I've ever seen in a story. It takes a sharpness of mind to recognize the moment when the ground is finally shifted, to understand that this time is different and act on it before the moment closes. And then the winter. The slow, unglamorous work of healing Ruth's homestead. The fence posts, the wood stove, learning to sleep through a full night. None of that is what stories usually linger on. We prefer the dramatic rescue, the courtroom moment, the villain led away in irons. But I think the hardest part of Josephine's story, and the most honest part, is that winter. The part where nothing is resolved yet, and she still has to get up in the morning and do the work in front of her. That's where character actually forms, not in the crisis, but in the long ordinary stretch after it. What I carry away from her story is something I'd rather show my kids than explain to them. That doing right by someone, even a stranger, even when it inconveniences you, sets something in motion that you cannot always see from where you're standing. That a clear mind, even when it's exhausted, can find the one open door. And that survival, real survival, the kind that results in a life worth living, is built the same way the homestead was built. Slowly, with your hands. One post at a time, in the cold. Josephine didn't recover the 3 years she lost, but she didn't need to. She just needed to still be there when the spring came. So did I, once. Maybe so did you.